Gabe Supporter one time told me that all a label is a bank and a marketing agency. And I thought that was so horrible at the time. That was like the most like cold-hearted shit I had ever heard at that time.
Welcome, everyone, to This Was The Scene, the podcast that takes a look back at the late 90s, early 2000 punk scene. I am your host, Mike Doyle. Negative Progression Records was a label that formed in 1998 by Seth Hyman. They released some of the best indie, emo, pop, punk, hardcore, and metal bands. I'm great at reading. The catalog included such bands as Counterfeit, Over It, Five Driver, The June Spirit, Bounder, and a ton more. I remembered NPR from back in the day because they released this Five Driver album called Self-Proclaimed Rockstars, and I thought that was such a ballsy fucking album name. So we do talk about that. I connected with Seth, got him on the Skype, and this is what we chat about. The Five Driver artwork for the CD I just talked about, the show with skinheads versus straight edge kids, his band Lipmonger, starting Negative Progression, dealing with band breakups, playing a show where Hopeless happened to be in the crowd, Over It leaving the label to go to Lobster Records, dealing with the bands on the label, almost signing Midtown, the Substance Free Coalition, bands that he wasn't able to sign, the Lumberjack distribution story, and a ton more. Make sure you check out their Bandcamp page. It's in the show notes. I have a link there. You can just go to negativeprogressionrecords.bandcamp.com. You can also hire Seth to represent you legally since he's a lawyer down in Orlando. You just go to SethHymanLaw.com. Couple things. This week's sponsor is Mint 400 Records. Mint 400 Records is a boutique indie rock record label located in northern New Jersey with bands across the United States, Canada, and Europe. The label features great Jersey bands of the past few decades in addition to new indie rock, indie folk, and post-punk bands. Over 350 exciting releases they've done. You can find Mint 400 Records releases streaming at Spotify, Pandora, Tidal, Apple Music, Amazon Music, Deezer, I still don't know what the fuck Deezer is, and more, or at the MP3 outlets worldwide. Visit mint400records.com for links and more info. Here's a clip from their band Ultra Major's song, Lost in the Moment. I also want to talk about a nonprofit organization called Pizzastock who reached out to me recently, and this is what they're about. The Jason R. Flood Memorial is a newly established nonprofit founded after the suicide death of Jason Flood. It began as a way for the youth in our community to communicate with one another and know that they are not alone. Our goal is to raise awareness of suicide prevention and to feel comfortable to speak up and reach out when warning signs are recognized. We have partnered with other local mental health providers and organizations to build leadership and confidence in youth programs. We are constructing education and peer support groups to offer guidance for a variety of mental health issues, particularly with the tween and teen age groups. Information can be found at pizzastock.org. Their next event is on Saturday, which will be tomorrow if you're listening to this podcast, January 9th, in the form of a live stream Battle of the Bands set at Events United, the company that put on the massive Dropkick Murphys live stream last March. Again, you can go to pizzastock.org if you want to find out more information or see how you can donate and help. 3 ways to support the podcast. 1, go to patreon.com/thiswasthescene. You can sign up for $1 a month. That's $12 for the year. 2, you could donate one time at thiswasthescene.com. You just go there. It's a purple button on the top of the website. Scroll down just a little bit. You'll see it. Donate whatever you'd like. You could send it through Venmo or PayPal. And again, whatever you'd like. 3, you could buy merch on thiswasthescene.com. I would say merch is cool. Donations are better. But merch is cool because you can wear it and support it. And people are like, what's that? You're like, oh, it's this super kick-ass fucking podcast about the late 90s scene. They're like, no shit. And you're like, yes. And then they buy a shirt or donate, and they listen. Cool. Feel free to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with anyone who would love some punk rock nostalgia. With that said, let's get started.
I've learned my lessons from, decades of being a punk rocker talking shit, so.
Okay, let's start there. I'm so fascinated by, I was rereading the email you sent me with just kind of like some highlights and stuff that had happened back then. So this is an interesting interview because this is going to go from Lipmonger talking about that, which the band started in 96. Was that true?
95 actually.
Okay. So
95 actually.
so it's cool because we could talk about that and then talk about Negative Progression Records, which I remember hearing about that label back in the 90s because of Five Driver. And I
Nice.
remember them getting on your label because their record, the album had such a funny like name. What was the name of it again?
Yes, it was called Self-Proclaimed Rock Stars.
Yes, I remember that. That
And
was such a ballsy statement to have on as
y-
a record.
yeah, and actually I designed the artwork on that record. On a lot of my earlier records, I designed the artwork because I studied advertising in college in Boston,
Huh.
and so I just was going for it, and I thought it was funny, so I made a joke on kind of like a big Kiss or Motorhead kind of rock star kind of image there, and I made it say Five Driver in lights, the logo.
Did you find that when that record came out that people got the joke, or did it give a little backlash to the band because of the name?
I don't think there was. I mean, I wasn't aware of any backlash. The label was obviously so small at the time. It was the first CD that we put out. I think it was kind of known as a joke. I think it was just like so obvious that it was just funny. Plus, I mean, the band wasn't big at all. They were still growing. They hadn't really toured, if I remember. They sounded like Good Riddance, so they weren't really musically like a rock star kind of band.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about how big the band was at that time and seeing them and playing shows with them, and yeah, they were like all the other bands that we all were at that time. We were just small bands with a little bit of a following, but nothing crazy. Like we wouldn't fill Starland or you would know like the Middle East or anything like that.
Right. I mean, at that time, it was just the whole New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York scenes were kind of very interwoven, and the bands just all played with each other all the time, and everyone was kind of. I mean, this was basically before. It was like before Bigwig. It was like Bigwig was just starting, and Weston were just kind of big. Everyone was just small.
You mentioned too the Boston scene. There was someone who messaged me recently. They were like, "Do you remember?" I forget how the story went. I mean, this is just like a couple months ago, but I think they pointed out Massachusetts, and I had mentioned the Lowell show that we had played there as my band, and they were like, "Yeah, I was there at that show." And I just remembered that's the show that made me fall in love with the Boston scene. And I've always had a giant, love for Boston because my family's from that Massachusetts, and my dad's from Massachusetts, so like he always had his Boston accent. So like I always loved Mass, but when we went there and played, the scene was so great and the kids were always so amazing. So that was like another scene that I just at anytime we'd go and it was like there, Merrimack, the Middle East was like, that's obviously that's in Boston, but
Yeah.
it was just everyone up there was just always fucking awesome. So you also got to witness growing up in a great scene.
Yeah. Well, actually, oddly enough, I grew up in Florida. I went to college in Boston.
Well, then I take back what I said.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's okay. I did. I was lucky enough to grow up with a really, really awesome local band in Orlando, Florida called Shyster, who was an
Yes.
awesome band in the early 90s, mid 90s, and they were just an incredible, super fast, kind of like Epitaph Fat style melodic punk band. I went to I went to college for a couple of years in Atlanta and met and became closer friends with a guy that ended up being in Litmonger with me. He started Litmonger because pretty much I was in Atlanta. He went to college in Hartford and started Litmonger. And then I was transferring colleges to Boston University. And since I was going to be so close to Hartford, I basically toured. I toured with the band. We were best friends. So I put out that was like the first Negative Progression release, the first Litmonger records, and we toured in the summer of 96 and 97. But I was in Boston And then I was also, in conjunction with playing in Litmonger, I started putting on shows in New England. And especially after I left Litmonger, I really was focusing on the label and putting on shows. And one of my personal goals was to try to help get bands from Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York up to New England and do show trades. And that was the way to get New England bands down there. So that was like one of my main goals when I was in college.
Where in Florida did you grow up?
Orlando.
Oh, you said Orlando. Now, did you get involved in the scene in Florida, or did you find out about it when you were living in Atlanta?
I started like everyone who's just getting into punk rock. They go to a couple shows here and there. And it's also like really different in Florida than it is in like the tri-state area up there or even in New England, because there's so many people into punk music. Even though Florida has had a number of good bands, I mean, at that time in the early 90s, that was before Less Than Jake, before Hot Water, before most of the bands that people know. So growing up in Florida at that time was like growing up in Oklahoma or Washington State or wherever that doesn't really have like a huge scene. But I was really into skateboarding in middle school like everybody else. And, I was fortunate to have some friends that played in music, and I played drums. I had a skater friend who in 92, he was telling me about one of our friends' bands was opening for this cool California band on one of their first, I think it was their second trip to Florida, their first trip to Orlando, called Green Day. And it was on the Kerplunk tour. And so I was like, oh man, this is cool. Like I'll go, with some skater friends and go check out this punk rock band from California. And I'd only heard a few punk rock bands at that time. And it was so awesome because it was packed. It was like in a little like bar. It was probably, I don't know, 200 people maybe. And I was literally right in the front. Billy Joe was like screaming, in my face. And it was when he had short dreads and stuff. And
Yeah.
I just was just bonkers. It just blew my mind. And then after that, I started getting more into one or two of my friends' local bands. And that was my introduction. But I really didn't get immersed until I went to college in Atlanta. And that was in 94.
Well, why though? What was it about going to college? I mean, obviously going to college, obviously in college you're away from home and it's a new experience. You have freedom, and then you get to just kind of start figuring out who you are. What was going on up there that made you get more involved in like the scene?
Well, at that time, Atlanta had a really, really thriving like melodic hardcore scene. My favorite band up there was a band called Act of Faith, but there were a bunch of other bands that were just killing it. And I was super into hardcore at that time. I mean, I've always been into pop punk and hardcore. I was straight edge. I was just getting really close with my friend Ruben, who eventually was going to form Litmonger, and we just jammed a lot. And pretty much like we were just learning about punk rock from zines like Maximum Rock and Roll and stuff. And we literally, I mean, it sounds like I'm telling a fake story, but we literally would like buy Maximum Rock and Roll. We would look at like the ads from Epitaph or Fat, and like we knew like one band or two bands, and then we would be like, oh, okay, there's this other band from Fat Records, and I know this no effects or whatever. So we would go to Tower Records and just go to there was like a little small punk section. We would just look through it, be like, okay. And every week or two, we would each buy one CD and like just listen to them together. So over the course of the year, like we bought a bunch of stuff, whether it was like Minor Threat discography or Operation Ivy or the early Bad Religion stuff or whatever. And that's really how I got into punk rock and going to shows, because Ruben had been in punk bands like earlier in middle school. And also I ran a college radio show with someone I met who was from DC, and he was really into the whole Discord 80s emo type stuff. So I was learning a lot from him, and it was just it sounds cheesy, but like for me, the first year or two of college was really like musical awakening.
What were you collecting then though? Were you buying tapes or vinyl or CDs? Like what was the medium?
At that point, I was buying CDs, I think. Like when I was younger, I bought tapes. I never bought a lot of vinyl, and I think that's why Negative Progression never really put out vinyl until like, I mean, the first couple 7 inches, and then the last record I put out was a 7 inch, and that was it. Yeah, it was mostly CDs. But when I first started buying CDs when I was in high school, and it was like grunge bands and stuff, you would get the CD in this like tall vertical cardboard box.
Yeah. Yep.
And I don't really understand the point of that, but yeah, that's
People have talked about that before, and I remember that the first Christmas I asked for a CD player, and I got this boombox, and I got all these CDs. My parent, I don't know where the hell they got the list, but it was like Metallica and Vogue, fucking what was it, PM Dawn. I might have talked about this in another issue, in another interview, but I remember that they came in those long boxes, and I remember thinking like, in this, is there supposed to be something extra in this? Like it went from that, and then within like less than a year, that was just the CDs. It was just that shit just went away, and I was so confused by that. I was like, why the fuck? I don't understand why they did this. I mean, who
yeah,
knows?
I think that it was because you know what I think it was is because with vinyl, full length vinyl, the art is so important and the liner notes are so important. And then for years, it went to cassettes and it was so small
Good
that I
point.
think maybe they were like, you know what, there's this new medium. We could make it in this little square, but how cool would it be to focus and emphasize the art again in some way? Because when I bought some of those CDs, like, Pearl Jam and Nirvana and the
Yeah.
grunge stuff, I would cut basically one slice into that big box and unfold it so it was flat and just put it on my wall, like with pins, like it was a poster almost.
Right, but that was the weird thing because they printed it on cardboard,
Right.
which was so weird. But I don't know. I'm not gonna stick on this the
Yeah.
whole time. But I just
Yeah.
remember it
No.
was so
It,
odd.
it was, I mean, I think that was one of the things that really separated the 90s punk scene from the, 2000s punk scene. Obviously, the internet was such a huge thing because like you were asking me how I got into different punk stuff, and it's like it was so hard to find in the 90s. It was so, secret. It was like your cool thing because no one else knew about it.
Right.
And like even when I went to college in Atlanta, the first summer I came home to Florida, and like I made friends with some other punk kids, and like they took me to like a show that happened in a garage, and I had never been to a show in a garage, and Bound played from New Jersey with Jason, who later sang in Kid Dynamite.
Yeah.
That was like really cool because this kid was like screaming into this microphone, writhing on the floor, and I'm like, whoa, this is pretty cool, dude. And then that summer, I also like went with those friends to Tampa, and I saw Snapcase for the first time, and there was literally a riot between a bunch of skinheads, because Tampa has a lot of Nazi skinheads, and like just a ton of straight edge kids beat the living crap out of them, and one guy got stabbed. Actually, it was crazy. It was really
Jesus
crazy.
Christ.
So, like I was sitting in the back, and I had never really been to a real hardcore show before. I've been in punk shows. These skinheads just walked in a row and like walked single file into the pit and just then stood shoulder to shoulder, kind of breaking up the whole pit so no one could dance. And then like about 6 or 7 straight edge kids just did the same thing and like were parallel to them in front of them. And then at the same time, they all just turned around and faced them at the same time. Everyone was like, oh shit. And my buddy gave me his glasses. He's like, hold these glasses. We're about to get into a fight. And the entire crowd just jumped on these skinheads, and the whole show got shut down. It was crazy. It was Snapcase, Donuts from Europe, and Frodis.
So a couple things there. One, the skinhead thing has come up a bunch of times recently in the last couple interviews, and this has mostly been from the Pennsylvania standpoint. It's like Angelo from Grieving Eucalyptus, we talked about it in length about the skinhead issue, and then Jeff Kish, who was in Dawson High and then later in Weston, and he was in Digger for a minute. He was talking about skinheads as well. For some reason, I remember hearing, and I could be making this up, but I don't know why. I always thought that Orlando had a skinhead like problem there, problem like a skinhead presence. But I remember it was like Orlando seemed to be a thing that I remember about hearing about them having a skinhead like presence, not Pennsylvania or other spots. I don't know why. Was Orlando like that bad, or am I just thinking about
I
this
think
wrong?
you're right. I mean, well, for example, in my high school, like I ate lunch with two skinheads every day. But I was like, but the thing was is that there were a lot of sharp skinheads, skinhead against racial prejudice, and there were a lot of Nazi skinheads that would like I would just hear, I never saw them, and I'm Jewish actually, so I'm aware of that. And
Yeah.
so, I think a lot of this Nazi skinheads would hang out like at the beach, like the beach areas, and Tampa had a lot of Nazi skinheads. So basically like the sharp skin, it was this big like sharp skinhead versus Nazi skinhead thing. And so these kids that I would eat lunch with, they would just tell us these stories about like, oh, what'd you do this weekend? Oh yeah, I played basketball and video games with my friends. And they're like, oh yeah, we went and got into a huge fight and beat up some Nazis. Okay, cool. That's cool. I'm Jewish. I like that.
Shit, man. I would love to interview someone who was a skinhead, who's not still, obviously.
Yeah.
I would love to interview someone who was like a neo-Nazi skinhead and like changed their life and was like, oh, that was wrong and awful, and this is, but get their perspective. Or someone who was in like, I didn't know there was a whole skinheads against racial, what was it? Sharp?
Skinhead against racial prejudice.
Like someone like that, where it's like, tell me about your weekends and what was it's like I remember hanging out with my friends and we'd be sitting there in someone's room when their parents are on the opposite side of the house and we're like smoking cigarettes out the window and trying to sneak in booze or just listening to records and shit. It's like these guys were just sitting there being like, all right, we're gonna go to this thing and we're gonna beat the shit out of other skinheads, or if they were the neo-Nazi ones, like we're gonna go and just be awful people.
It's a crazy thing too, because like there wasn't a lot of violence like that in Atlanta. It was a very like posy scene, which is cool. But when I went to Boston, obviously it was like the height of FSU. And, I went to a number of shows, and I was this singer of the band Diecast is one of my best friends. And so they were friends with a lot of FSU guys, and some of the band was in FSU. So like
Wait,
I
what's FSU? Why am I fucking this up?
Sorry. FSU was a hardcore gang in Boston, kind of like DMS in New York.
Okay, again, I'm like drawing a blank.
Sorry.
No
It's
idea.
like a hardcore thing.
Yeah,
Like
yeah. No, it's interesting because it's like I'm learning now about this. Like, oh,
basically, like FSU was a group of very strong, scary men who would be at shows in Boston. Sometimes would beat a lot of people up. And eventually, over time, they started actually putting on shows. So when FSU would put on a show, they would, run security. So there would never be fights. Because if there was a fight, you would just get destroyed. But yeah,
so okay,
it's
so because I want to like talk more, give you, talk more about Libmonger and then the record label. But I mean, I do love where that was going. But okay, so kind of like bleeds into it. So you see all this shit going on. And then you get into Litmonger when you moved to Boston, when you went to school up there as well?
yeah.
Okay. So it's like,
Yeah.
I kind of know the answer to this, and I mean, we would play shows in front of, sometimes skinheads would show up, and it was never like, oh, we shouldn't do this. So I'm just going to ask this question anyway, but you were witnessing that happening, but I'm guessing it wasn't like all the time where when you got, you got in the band or you created the band, you're not sitting there going, okay, but we got to really be afraid of these like skinheads at shows, so we shouldn't do this.
No, but like also at that time, I mean, Litmonger was a pop punk band.
Yeah.
So we didn't really play shows that skinheads, hung at.
But they would sometimes just roll in like assholes. Like three of them would just run in and just fuck shit up in a pit or something. But yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
If you were
I mean,
hardcore,
sometimes,
it'd be different.
but like when we were playing, I mean, all the members of the band went to University of Hartford, and so I would go there and we would play in Connecticut, we would play around New England, we would play in Jersey. So like our initial drummer, he was from Red Bank, New Jersey, and our guitar player was from Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. And so we just sort of like played in Jersey and Pennsylvania a lot, and then we played New England because of me. And then that first summer of 96, we basically did a quote unquote tour from New England down to Washington, D.C. And that was booked through Book Your Fucking Life, Book Your Own Fucking Life. Then the next summer we actually toured. We drove from Pennsylvania. We had our second 7-inch release record show, and we drove straight to California.
What?
And in like 3 days or something, we just rotated. We would drive in like 6 or 7 hour shifts, and then we got to California, and then we did a California tour, and then on the way back we drove to the Midwest and we played throughout the Midwest. That was in the summer of '97, so it was really nutso.
So you were going to school. How long was the band together?
The band was together, I think, 2.5 years.
I feel like that's like legit the lifespan of bands who played some shows, got some recognition, and then would tour. But it's like there was a burnout. Eventually, they would get burned out by either not having a label that could support them or some kind of internal shit. But there was like that 2.5 year lifespan. It seems to be. If I go back through some interviews in my brain that some of the bands I've talked to, like they're like, yeah, we were like maybe 3 years, which is so funny to me because like looking back, the names are still relevant, and you still remember these names of bands, but it's just funny. It's like they were here for like a second.
Well, I think it also depends on like time in the punk universe and where they fit into the tapestry of our scene. But like when Lipmonger was playing, it was just so early. I mean, it was literally like when like Cheshire Cat came out, and like we were super into Blink, and Weston's first record had come out, and we were super into Weston, and like it was like before Digger and everything. And it was just like there weren't that many bands. It sounds silly to even say, but there weren't really that many bands playing silly pop punk. And like I didn't write the lyrics. Our guitar player Andrew wrote the lyrics, and he was really just like a goofy guy. And so and he wrote a lot of silly songs, like songs about nachos and jumping on trampolines and being in love, and like every other song was about like being in love. But it was also like the way the lyrics were written were just like talking about being in his Cub Scout troop, and just really kind of like the pop punk version of like the old show The Wonder Years or something, like some idyllic kind of love fest and silliness. And so that's what we were all about. And we like were really active when we played. Like physically, we like jumped all over the place and made stupid faces and that kind of a thing.
Which band did you get that from? Because I know from me, I've talked about like seeing Bigwig for the first time, and they were jumping around, but they weren't. It was like aggressive, not like it wasn't like silly and goofy. It was like we're beating the shit out of this stage right now, and that's what I loved. So like, it was hard to match that with poppy songs.
I think that for us, it was a combination also of the people, because like when we first started, 3 out of the 4 guys were straight edge, and we were in the hardcore, but we were playing pop punk, and it's not like, I mean, not really like how some of the bands a little bit later were mixing, any kind of hardcore attitude or whatever. But we
like poppy songs with like that screamo like voice.
Yeah, we didn't have any screaming or anything. We were totally really influenced by like Blink, early Blink, and Weston's first stuff. And like Weston was a big influence on us, their early stuff, because when Chuck, the bass player, was in the band, they all shared vocal duties, and Chuck was really silly and would wear like his high school wrestling uniform when he played. And he was just like, and Dave Weston was like complete space cadet. Lipmonger was kind of like a melding of old Blink and old Weston.
I love how Weston has come up I mean, I've interviewed 3 of the people in the band. I got Chuck, Jesse, and then Jeff. And it's like they had such an impact on so many bands from back then remember that band because like Got Beat Up, that album was great because they did different vocal duties, and their stage show was so great because they didn't take it too seriously, and I loved that. Like you mentioned Blink, and I remember when Cheshire Cat came out, one of my friends got a 7-inch with them or got Cheshire Cat, and we're listening to it, and this is the time where some of the bands, they wouldn't put pictures in, or they kind of did, so you kind of knew what they looked like. There was like a mystery there, but you knew that they were goofy as well because there were those random skits they would do, like they did the airplane skit the one time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And but the songs were so fucking good that, like, that plus the goofiness, a lot of bands I feel would be like, oh, we can make the songs goofy but kind of serious, but we can also not, in the stage show, we should just not be so like tense or wound up. Like we can just be goofy and hopefully it works.
Well, I think what it is that just like being a, I guess, student of punk history and everything, like, I mean, the punk scene was so on life support until like Bad Religion Suffer came out. From what all these interviews I've heard and read, like Fat Mike talk about, and it's like Suffer came out, and that was like in like, I don't know, 89 or 90 or something like that. And then, NoFX was like about to break up, and it inspired them to keep going, and it's just this
Oh,
interesting
really?
story. Yeah, yeah. And so like in the early 90s, when those first few Fat records came out, I mean, the Lagwagon record, the Propaganda first record and stuff, I mean, I think that a lot of people who liked punk music in different parts of the country, like, pop punk was really, maybe I'm not correct in this, but in my view, it seems like pop punk really was only alive in California at that time. And I just think that it was so cool for the East Coast
That's a
to
good
have a
point.
band like Weston that was like really good, really catchy, and really silly, and just so physical, because the East Coast was just always such a like hardcore
Yeah, taking ourselves too
focused.
seriously. I mean, we had like New York City and the bands that came out of there, but I mean, like the Ramones, like they were poppy and they were fun,
Yeah, but that's
But
so long ago. I mean like kid bands.
yeah, no, it's true. That's a good point. I mean, there were definitely, I bet people listening are probably like, no way, man, like our bands were poppy, but there's the bands that were doing the pop punk sound that weren't really noticed, and then there's the bands who we were hearing on the mixtapes when we'd go and skate or in someone's car, or someone would give us a mixtape and you heard those bands, right?
Or
And
like some of those early comps, like first comps on Hopeless or Fearless or
yeah,
Fat, or those kinds of very first comps where you're just like, or like Drive Through, or whatever, where you're just like, oh wow, I didn't know about this band from somewhere in Texas, or this band from Chicago, or whatnot. They're poppy too.
which is I just love that. I loved, even to this day. There's a band. What the hell was the song? Pumpkin Eyes, or there was a Crank Records comp. My buddy John Price, he used to play the song all the time, and I forget the name of the band. It's something Eyes, and it was like the beginning song on this comp. It's the only song I've ever heard of this band. But to this day, I hold that song so high and that band so high because we used to crank that song and we are like, if this who is this band? Like they're
Right.
on a
And
comp and
and
it's like
that
how did
was
it get in
why
front of
it was
me?
so fun. Like, you didn't have the internet to like find them. It was just like, oh yeah, I got this comp from Revelation Records and just found out about all these amazing bands, and like, oh, Shades Apart, they're from New Jersey. Litmonger played with them, and like, oh, they're a legit band, and oh wow, they're really good live. Okay, this is one of my new favorite bands. Great, cool.
Yes. Actually, I think the band is Silver Scooter. Silver was I think it was, yeah, I don't know. I had to like look that up because I was like, it was gonna drive me fucking nuts. I'm so it's interesting to get your perspective about this too because you went from being in a band, and I'm gonna talk about that more, and then you got to see what it was like to be in a band and tour a little bit, write songs, try to take it as far as you could, and
Yeah.
then you have the perspective of having a label, which is funny because it's not funny, but it's like when you hear anyone, if they're just living on either just on one side, they're gonna have a completely different perspective. Like bands are gonna go, this label was shit, it didn't do anything for us, and then the
Yeah.
label side, you're like, you guys aren't even fucking marketing yourselves. You expect
Yeah.
us to do everything. And I wish I had the mentality that I do now because of just freelancing for such a long time and working for myself. If I had this knowledge and was in a band now, if I was in a fucking band now, the fucking possibility of you just there's so much at your like fingertips to market yourself
Yeah.
just between Instagram and stuff. And when we played a couple years ago, like I got to make an account for on Instagram and I had such a blast with it. I was like, holy shit, you can do so much as a band. And but now if the bands are like, the label's not doing anything, it's like you have to step it up.
Yeah.
It's interesting that I'm excited to dissect how you saw both sides. So before we get into like having the label, did you start the label during the band or did you start it after?
I started during the band. So basically,
That's
and
wild.
I talk so much. If you want to turn this into, 2 interviews, that's fine. Um, but so basically, when I was in Atlanta before Lipmonger formed, and Ruben and I were jamming and stuff, and I was learning about the local scene, and there was that band Act of Faith I liked. The guitar player started a label and put out some of the local bands, and Ruben and I were writing songs, and we had a little hardcore project that was called 30 BC, and we recorded it at a studio. And I was just like, oh man, if these Active Faith guys can put out a 7-inch, like, hey, I'm gonna try it, that would be cool. And I asked them, like, where the pressing plant was, and just for fun, I was just like, I'm gonna do this. And then Ruben actually went to college, started Lipmonger, and sent me the demo tape on cassette, and I was like, oh, this is cool. And then that, as the summer was approaching, the summer of 96 was approaching, their bass player, they wanted to tour and their bass player couldn't tour. I was transferring to Boston, and I was just like, hey, what if I take your demo, or I take the second demo and put it out on 7-inch, and then we can have something to sell, and I'll join the band and we'll tour the Northeast the summer of 96. And so it just kind of was an organic thing.
Interesting. So you actually
Yeah.
got to see both sides while you were in the band itself. So any shit
Yeah.
talking about the label, if there was any, you're like, okay, I'm right here.
Well, it's
Like,
also like before, I mean, I can't, it's hard to put your head in that space, because like at that time, when I was, 90, 95 or whatever it was, the labels that I liked were all run by band members. Like I liked Fat Records, which was run by Fat Mike, and I liked Discord, which was run by Ian MacKaye, and Epitaph, run by Brett Gurwitz from Bad Religion. And so like I think that all of the labels that became big in the early 2000s that were starting around that time too, like Hopeless and Drive Through and Fearless and stuff, those guys weren't in bands. I like those guys very much. It's not a slight on them. It's just they were not in bands.
yeah.
And so it's just a different
Oh, totally.
perspective.
Oh, 100%. Like, I'm trying to think of like a comparison here, but yeah, I'm trying to think. I was gonna say like, like a sports reference. You could be like a football coach. We didn't play football. You don't really know, but
Right.
yeah, it's like if you're not in it, and then you're telling people how to do it, you're gonna have a bit more of kind of like skin in the game, or an understanding or respect for the product, which is an awful way to put it as a band. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's music business. But you have you can have that sympathy on either side, which I think is more beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if a young label can get more cool bands, if you're in the band, if you're in a band because you play with other bands and they know you and they're friends with you and they want to put out a record on your label. If you're not in bands, you tend to have to run the kind of label where you throw more money at bands. And so like with Negative Progression, I was sort of on all sides, and I also booked shows in New England. And then when I moved to San Francisco, I booked shows in Northern California, and I booked tours for a lot of the bands on Negative Progression too. So
Damn.
I was literally trying to do everything I could imagine to help support my bands that I wanted to work with. It's a challenge. It's being in a band and running a label is two of the most challenging and rewarding things I've ever done. And they really formed who I am in a lot of ways.
Well, what do you do now? You're in law?
I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. Yeah.
So do you find that present day, even though it's not in front of your face, that you stop sometimes and think and go, man, I kind of learned this from doing this shit back in the day?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I have my own small law practice. I do criminal defense work. Years ago, I was prosecutor, which is the other side of the criminal equation. When I started my law practice, I mean, I knew a lot of things about marketing and advertising and how to run a small business and what not to do from my successes and failures with the band and with the label. There are a lot of things that you do when you start a small business because you think that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
But you end up losing money because it's not a good way to actually be fiscally responsible as far as your expenses.
Well, it's almost, it comes down to, it's like, this is the business section of the podcast, kids.
Yeah.
It's, I always people come to me all the time who are like, I want to be able to work for myself, but I want to get business cards first and a website. I go, why don't you what's your idea? They're like, well, I want to do this. I go, well, why don't you start doing it? They're like, yeah, but I need this first. I go, no, you don't need that first. Just make what you're doing really good. And
Yeah.
like, I remember I was watching Masterclass last year. I watched the Stephen Martin one, and he said the same thing. He's like, don't get an agent. He's like, just be really good at your craft. So it almost goes back to just the band itself, is that bands were so focused going into like the 2000s, I thought, about the hair and the makeup and all that bullshit, where they wouldn't even really work on the sound. And it's like, this is like really just going all over the place, but I think as the band, if bands out there, you don't need all that. Like, you can have the best shirts and the best merch and the best CD cover and crap, but all you have is someone's ears. So when you put this shit in, like, the thing could look amazing, but everyone knows when they listen to a song or a CD, they're all kind of on the same level of like, this is totally worth it or this is complete shit. And you're like, oh, the band didn't even try to write, they didn't focus on the songs. They like focused too much on everything else. So like, did you guys, oh, that was kind of like just like a rant, but it's just like,
I mean, I
focus
think
on the
the
core of the
scene,
product.
the scene just shifted so much. Like, I mean, literally, what the punk scene was like in the mid to late '90s was the exact opposite of what it was in the, like, let's say, middle 2000s. There was just so much money that potentially a band could earn, and there was just so much money that bands were being given by independent labels, and there was so much money bands were getting guaranteed on, and it was just totally different. People could find you could become as big as anybody. And in the 90s, it was like, literally, okay, we're doing this for ourselves and we're going to photocopy. Like, the exciting thing that you do with the cover of your 7-inch is use color paper.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
You're like, oh, this color, this cover is not going to be black and white copy. This is going to be lime green or
Yeah.
paper.
Lime green and black ink. It's gonna look super cool.
It's just so different. It
But I think
was
like,
so different.
but like people had that's the difference, is that I think without all you had was your sound, and you didn't really have that much. Especially if you didn't have a label, you couldn't really market yourself. You didn't have that great that extent, like your arm didn't reach as far out, so you had to
Yeah.
be really fucking good, and your local like your show had to be really good, because that's where you'd catch people, and then the marketing was word of mouth.
I mean, the number one way to succeed in punk rock was just to stay together, just not to break up.
True.
I mean, I have had so many bands on my label, and have been friends with so many bands that like are just about to break out and do good, and then either they've just been struggling and building slowly, which is the right way to build, but they were just building slowly for too long for a particular member or a couple members, or someone's getting, also these are kids that are like college age, so their parents are giving them a hard time about going back to college, or a lot of bands I encountered, someone didn't want to tour as much as the other people in the band, so
Yeah.
in a sort of warped way of thinking, they thought, I'm going to quit the band so they can find someone to replace me that wants to tour as much. But the problem is, like, they were trying to help the band, but the problem is like, quitting the band, suddenly all the momentum is gone, and they have to find somebody and they have to train them, and then it's just like a whole year is gone, and that like destroyed so many bands that I knew.
Yeah, and you got to see that firsthand too, because you'd put out releases, and then you got to see that, where I'm sure that became an effect where this band would do that, and it's like a couple bands you're like, God damn it, I just know where this is gonna
Oh
go.
yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I had a number of bands, early. I mean, so many of the bands were doing well and then kind of imploded. But I mean, with each band, there's different stories, right? But a lot of times it always came down to interpersonal issues where one member didn't get along, or certain people are writing the songs for the first record or two, and then other people want to contribute more, and then they don't like the new stuff, and then they just start fighting over the direction of the band, and they start believing hype that other people are telling them, oh, you're an awesome band, there's like hundreds of people at your local shows and you're primed to be a national band, and then they're just like explode.
Dude, I'll be honest, like the reason why I work for myself nowadays and like do the podcast by myself and I have like a comic that I do, it's legit because I just don't fucking want anyone else's opinion. Like I can't deal with from a creative side when you're trying to collaborate creatively, unless you're on the same fucking page with someone else and you both are starting off with the same vision and direction, it's like you're fucked because then also emotions get in the way. Like
Yeah.
I legit do things by myself because of being in a fucking band and then trying out all of these different business partnerships through the years. And I was like, you know what? I am just not good with other people's fucking feedback. Like, so I'm doing this shit by myself. I mean, your practice, are you by yourself?
I'm by myself. Yeah.
Yep.
I think that I would probably, if I get to the point where I need to, I think I would hire someone, but I don't know.
There's a difference.
I don't know if I
Hiring
could.
someone,
I don't know if I could be a partner.
yes.
Set up a partnership. I'm not sure.
Hiring someone, it's like I always tell my friends now where they're like, "Oh, you're like, I'll do this for free." I go, "No, because if you do it for free, I can't yell at you." It's
Yeah.
like- I mean, not to be a
Yeah.
dick, but like I'm saying, when you pay people, they also value that time that they're giving to you, and it's also, but you're like, this is my goal, and like I need to have you do it this way, which
Oh, for sure.
sounds like super dictatorship. Well, dictatorship, you wouldn't be paying anybody, but like yeah, like it just from that whole thing of being in a band, like the whole inner turmoil and emotions and all this bullshit from back then, especially the fact that we were all in our teenage years, so that's like a whole other piece of the equation or your piece of the puzzle that sucks. But so this is jumping around, but like Lipmonger, like how were you guys perceived? Like what was your audience? Like did you guys have a good fan base? Like what did that look like?
I would say that we had a growing fan base. I think that there were bands at that time that just like got super big locally, then toured. There were some bands like, I would say, like Cooter, who became Autopilot Off and Lounge, and those kinds of bands, that kind of came just after, around the same time, a little bit after Litmonger, like around the same time, maybe a year later, somewhat. But like bands in that vein, they were just like so big in their local town that hundreds of people would come out. And Litmonger was more like, we just started. I mean, Connecticut just doesn't really historically have a great scene, I would say. I mean, obviously there's the LNG, which was a venue there that touring bands played, but it wasn't like, in like Greg Wood was in West Beverly and Nigel Six and Punchline and stuff. But I just think that Lipmonger was more, and since I was from Florida and we were from all over the place, we were more like trying to play shows and tour as much as possible and sort of start having like a bit of a following in a bunch of different places. And then through the plan was repeated touring, like build overall. And whether that's a smart idea or not a smart idea, I mean, there's just different ways to do it. I think that for bands that are really, really big locally and they can like play that huge show, like Counterfeit, who was a band on my label in 2001 and 2002, they were really big in San Diego and in the rest of Cal. I mean, they were big in a lot of places, but initially they were really big in Southern California and a little in Northern California. And so when you're going on tour, as you know, money is so tight that like it's nice to be one of those bands that like you're the big band in your area. You can play a tour kickoff show, you make a lot of money, and you have that money for the tour because you know the tour is going to be like really difficult and you're not going to make a lot of money. Whereas Lipmonger, we would play some shows where there were a few dozen kids there. We would play some shows where we like opened for Weston a couple of times. We opened for Piebald in Boston when they were first starting.
Nice.
We played like with Autopilot Off, played our CD, our 7-inch release show. We played randomly in random places. Like we got to play in cool venues like the Fireside Bowl in Chicago. And we just, like I said, we toured out to California having just like 2 7-inches and we just put money into it ourselves. And back then, obviously, there wasn't really internet. So I booked the tour and it was like calling people. You call someone who's listed as like a promoter and they're like, okay, mail us the 7-inch. And so you mail somebody the 7-inch and they're like, yeah, I don't have that date available, but you should call this person and this person. And then you call those people and you just try to make something happen. And like some of our shows in California were like, we got there and like 1 or 2 of the shows fell through and we somehow found like a couple other shows where they're like, oh, you're from Connecticut. Okay. You could just jump on this show. Like we actually played a show that we went out to Hopeless Records because we really wanted to be on Hopeless. It was new at that time.
Yeah.
And we got one of the dudes there, Darren, who was the second in command, came to a show. We played at some like laser tag place, and it was like half hardcore bands and half pop punk bands, and like it was cool. But then the second we started playing, like a hardcore band played in front of us, and then as soon as we started playing, half the people went into the laser tag rooms. and then like Andrew, our guitar player, we were being really silly. Oh, and like one of the things he did sometimes was he had like, those old glasses where you have like a nose and Groucho Marx like mustache.
Yeah.
He had one that had like a penis. So it was just, stupid, silly stuff like that. And so like at one point he like tried to jump off his amp and he like leaned in the wrong way and the amp kind of like flipped back and he went straight down on the head of the neck, straight into the ground. It was just talk about your disaster show in front of Hopeless Records. Yeah, it was pretty bad.
Oh, that's awful. So you guys didn't get signed?
No, we didn't. But it was a really cool experience, and I mean, I do think that I actually quit the band at the end of that tour because I was so stressed out, and going back and forth from Boston was difficult, and I should, in hindsight, I wish I hadn't. I kind of did it for a girl also. So she wanted me to spend more time in Boston. So that was kind of a mistake, but it was, the whole thing was great experiences. And like we played cool little shows with, like we randomly played with this band called the Homeless Wonders, who we became friendly with. And like some of those guys went on to form Teenage Bottle Rocket.
Oh, wow.
Just like there's just, and like through them, I met Suburban Home Records, which Virgil Dickerson, who runs that label, ended up distributing for a little while, Negative Progression, and he's one of my closest friends also. So it's just like punk rock geography where, I've met some of my favorite people over the years.
It's like you said in a way for the bands, but I think in the scene in general, like you said, all punk bands need to do is just stay together and stick it out. And that kind of happened as well, where people in bands that they just stayed with the scene and stayed with the music or in the industry. And then a lot of them, not a lot of them, but I'm sure there's a bunch of people who did not work out. But I think when you stuck with it, like Teenage Bottle Rocket, right? Like they pretty much came into their own, in the late 2000s?
Really? Yeah, I think that's probably fair.
Yeah, and they're like a band that people really, they know about them and they have like a pretty good following. Yeah. And I'm like kind of drawing a blank on a bunch of people, but it's like if you just kind of stick it out and stay with it, it could really work out in your favor. And so like when you left the band for a girl, did you, because you're in school at the same time and you have the label and then the band is no more, did you just go full force into the label or did you have to balance that between that and your like school?
I mean, I pretty much went into the label a lot more, and I was booking shows. But I mean, I pretty much at that point I had put out the 5-driver record, I think shortly after that. I was also doing, some small ads and some mags and fanzines like Maximum Rock and Roll and Flipside. So there weren't that many like up and coming labels that were like paying for, and I was paying for my band's recordings and paying for everything and paying for ads. Not a lot of small bands. Like my first couple releases, I did little ads as well. So there were ads for Lipmonger, 7 Inches. We did a split with a band called the Mccrackens, which was a funny band at the time that was like Ramones style from Canada. And they dressed, this is so silly. This is so 90s. They dressed up like 2 eggs and a chicken when they played. And they all made names like the Ramones. Like one was Bill McCracken, the other one was Phil McCracken. It's just so. Anyways, I advertised that record, and then I put out the 5-driver record, and I advertised that, and then I put out a really great band from Michigan called Bounder, who is just awesome, and they toured a little bit. So I mean, I was slowly, and by that time I had graduated from college, and I just slowly building up. And then I would say the first kind of band that really broke for me or did well in the punk scene in that underground sort of way was Over It. Because like Over It sent me, I was starting to get demos because I was advertising. So I got Over It's demo. They were in high school. I think James was 15, maybe. They were like 15, 16, maybe 17. At the time. And like I went down to Virginia. They lived in Virginia, and I drove down to Virginia because their demo, which became the Duck EP, their first EP, no diss on the other demos that I got before, but like when I got that demo, I was just like, holy crap, like this is a legit awesome band. And so I drove down to Virginia and I stayed at Nick Bailey's house. I went and saw them play. We hung out. We just, it was just fun, and I decided to sign them, and they were really, really excited. And I got them on some shows in New England. I booked a couple small tours for them, but they were still in high school.
Well, how long were they on your label for?
They were on my label for, I guess technically it was like 3 years.
So how many releases did they
2
do?
EPs and a full length. So an EP, a full length, and then another EP. So we did the Duck EP, then we did the full length, the Ready series, and then we did the EP Hindsight 2020, and then they went to Lobster after that.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was going to get to because I interviewed Steve from Lobster, and he talked about them. And again, the thing is, like, I've said this multiple times in the last couple episodes, but there's a lot of information where I'm hearing something, I'm like, I know that sounds really familiar. Because I mean, I knew of Over It, but I was like, why does that sound familiar? So I opened up Wikipedia. I was like, Lobster Records. I was like, that's fucking it, because they went to Lobster.
Right.
What was that like to? Did Steve purchase the
Sorry.
Okay, no, go on.
No,
like, yeah,
what?
what?
He did not.
Okay, so how did that transition happen, and how did the band go to that?
Well, basically, so Yellow Card was doing well with their record on Lobster. They kind of blew up, and Yellow Card was a band that I received. They sent me their demo when they had their old singer, and it wasn't great, and I wasn't digging it. Then Ryan started singing for them, and like, whoa, they're awesome. And then Steve put them out. They started doing really well, and Over It toured California. I can't remember if it was after the first time they toured California or maybe the second. I'm not sure. I think probably just the first time. They satisfied their contract with me. I obviously loved Over It as people and a band, and they were one of my favorite bands and still are. And I was really hoping to continue working with them because my point of reference is like, Fat Records, Epitaph, they just, release an entire band's career, like multiple full lengths, and it just didn't work out that way. And I don't, you'd have to ask the band, but we put out the last EP, Hindsight 2020, and I wanted to put out the next full length maybe Steve had a little bit more money because of the yellow card proceeds, and maybe that was interesting to them. I can't remember if I was in California at that time because I moved to San Francisco in the summer of 2000. I was already out there too, but yeah, they just made that decision. I was bummed at the time. I have to be honest, and it's no secret.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, you can't blame someone for, and there's always two sides or two different perspectives and things. But I mean, yeah, if you're on the side of something where, I could be talking to them and they could be like, yeah, it was a bum thing, but we want to do this and it sucked, or like we didn't care, or like it's always gonna blow when you have a band that you really like, you're friends with. It's like there's the personal. Once the personal bleeds into the business,
Yeah,
that makes it a little bit harder. Even though if there was no personal, it was just business, you're still going to think like financially, this is a hit, this sucks, or any kind of break in general never feels good.
I'm a very passionate person, and back then I was young, so I was like very, very passionate. I put all of my time and energy, and I was just like some 24-year-old kid who just begged, borrowed, and stealed enough money to, put out the records that I could. I just put my blood, sweat, and tears into it, and I just really wanted. My dream was to, have bands that wanted to be part of a family, and just be part of my label. Like I actually, this is sad, but over the course of running Negative Progression for 16 years, I never was able to put out a second full length for a band. Crazy, right?
Oh wow, damn. But you could do a couple EPs and then a full length though.
Yeah, I did. I had situations where I put out EPs in the full length, or, it's just the bands always, had different problems, whether it was financial, interpersonal. I mean, sometimes later, once the label had more of a name, like years later, a lot of bands, they would struggle and work really hard. And then when they got signed, I mean, as ridiculous as it sounds, and I would tell them over and over and over, like, just getting signed to Negative Progression does not mean that suddenly I'm going to get you on, opening slots on all these tours, and you're going to suddenly be having tons more people at your shows. No matter how many times I said it, a lot of members of different bands, like they just thought that suddenly tons of people were going to just show up at their shows, and that didn't happen, and they were discouraged, and so they quit.
What would be a band's draw to want to get signed to Negative Progression back then?
I mean, I think like being part of a label with the history that we had. I mean, I'm very proud of all the quality of all the records that I put out, like the musicianship, and all of the bands that I put out were really great bands. And I think that like now you would say, oh, a label is like curating. As an owner of a label, you're curating your sound. I think that people really, really genuinely thought that the records I put out were good and wanted to be part of that. And the fact that I was offering to pay for their recordings, I was doing marketing that people were seeing, at one point I was doing, full page ads in alternative press every month. I ran a stage on the Warped Tour in 2003. I mean, I was doing stuff. I feel like there was a big gap between like super, super small labels and really, really big labels. And there weren't that many labels the size of Negative Progression that were kind of in between. I think that bands identified that. And I didn't necessarily think that I'm going to win out a band over a much bigger label. But I had a lot of bands that I talked to that were also ended up on Victory or Epitaph or Equal Vision or something like that.
Damn. That's gotta be like such a kick in the balls where you get them at the kind of like the sweet spot, and then they jump to another label where it's like the Equal Visions or something. You're like, I don't know how to compete with those labels.
Yeah, no, I mean, but then there's, fate. Fate is interesting. I mean, like the Over It situation, I think that the first full length on Lobster is their best record, and I love it. I know Steve, and I stayed at his house a number of times when I was in California on tour and stuff, and I think he's a great dude. And I love Park, and I love a lot of the records he put out. But of course, I wish that I put it out.
Yeah.
But then, went over it, changed their sound a little bit over the years. I wasn't super into their later stuff, but that's just my personal taste.
That's gonna happen anyway. But anyone who's a fan of music is gonna have that fan perspective where you're just gonna just show up and be like, I'm just gonna judge your music based on what I like. And if it changes, the fan perspective is gonna come in. It's like, well, that really wasn't like this album and stuff. I mean, that's like normal for people to do
Yeah.
that. I had so many questions pop up there. Fuck, I don't know which one to ask.
Well, so just as another example, like other bands in that time, like Counterfeit was doing very well, but the Mark and Adam, the drummer and the guitar player, were brothers, and they wrote all their stuff. I'm pretty sure, including the lyrics. I put out an EP and a full length for them, and we were, at that time, they were doing well and they were able to get a manager. And every single time I had a band that suddenly got a manager, the manager's first priority was getting them signed to a bigger label. And if they were contractually obligated to me, trying to get them off of my label. And that was a bummer, generally. So, but, Counterfeit, the guys that hadn't been writing from what I understand, wanted to take more part in writing the music, and it wasn't really, working out great what they were getting, and the band ended up breaking up over it.
I'm just gonna ask this. You don't have to name it. Just because it popped up, you can just defer the question. Was there a manager that you dealt with who you were like, this was the, you don't have to say their name, but do you remember a manager that you dealt with where you're like, this is the worst fucking person ever?
Yeah, just because, yes, because this manager person pretty much, I put a lot into the band, and emotionally and physically. And as soon as, basically at some point, they were like, yeah, we want to get out of the contract. And I'm like, okay, find somebody to buy out the contract. And they're like, no, we want you to just let them go. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. And it's really soured the relationship, because the band, this happened a couple times, so it's not necessarily one particular band, but
Yeah.
A couple times bands, this is the early 2000s, so a lot of these bands are getting interest from majors or really big labels, and or they're having or what happened a lot, especially in the Northeast, the Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania type bands, that all their friends were getting signed and getting huge. If you're like, you were in a band that was working hard, and people knew the name of your band and were familiar with your band. But, bands like your band, you're seeing the Midtowns of the universe. You're seeing the Bouncing Souls, you're seeing the Kid Dynamites or whatever. And you're seeing like, this band got, or even different, like I can't remember names, but you're seeing like this band gets signed to Drive Through, and then suddenly they're doing XYZ. And it's hard not to.
You feel like you feel like you deserve it. You feel like, well, they are in my scene. They're playing the same kind of shows. Their sound sounds kind of similar. They got on a fucking label. Why aren't those labels talking to it? Yeah, you feel like like you deserve it, and no one deserves shit.
Yeah, and so what ends up happening in those circumstances is like it's not even the president of the label really wants to sign the band. It's like some A&R guy who just goes to like one show,
right,
or is kind of friendly, and the A&R guy, the people in the band are like 20, and the A&R guy is like 26, and and he's like taking them out to a diner after the show, and paying for $40 of food, and
the story from the band is like, yeah, the label took us to dinner. You're like, wow, yeah, they took you to get some fries, disco fries, and Cokes.
yeah, and it's New Jersey, so it's a diner.
Yeah, know it's a diner, obviously.
So so then you have like bands who are just like calling me, being like, come on, we're friends, we appreciate what you did for us, but now we want to go to the next level, and you're holding us back because this A&R guy says that if we weren't on a label, maybe blah blah blah. And I'm like, I know that labels like Equal Vision and Fearless sold bands contracts to other labels, And the way I look at it, I'm like, I put a lot of time and energy and money into my bands. Why shouldn't I be able to sell the rights to the last record
Yeah.
that I have you under contract for?
Right.
And, that soured a lot of relationships, not a lot, but some relationships with some bands that I really cared about, and people that I cared about. Had some different times where I was a little pissed.
I bet. I mean, did you find that when you would sign new bands after shit like that happened, you'd have to have a different approach just so it set you up to where they weren't like, hey, we're buddies, we're best friends. You're like, you kind of treated the band a little bit differently so they knew there wasn't, I'm not doing this as a favor?
I think that yes and no, as time went on. So each time I had a real difficult experience or a couple of experiences all at once, I pretty much was like, screw this. I don't want to do the label anymore. This is not worth it. And I
Yeah.
wouldn't put out something for a year or two. And then I would get an amazing demo. And I swear it sounds so cheesy, but I would get an amazing demo that I couldn't stop listening to. And I'd be like, oh man, I really want to help this band. I know that I can help them get their music out, and this is so good. And that happened to me on 2 or 3 occasions where, just sort of I was building, and then a bunch of bands would break up at the same time or near each other. And then I would be like, screw this. And also that, the scene was changing over the time,
Yeah.
and more money was required, but the internet was out there, so people were buying less. So it was really weird because I started to spend less money on recording for bands, and I started trying to do more with booking, and I started giving bands actual money for gas on tour, which
Wow.
I started doing more postcards that they'd have at their merch table and shirts. And really over time I ended up doing more things that were directly helpful to the band and not just sort of marketing their brand.
So this popped in my brain. What would you have had your bands do differently where they could have had more success? Not songwriting
That's
wise,
tough.
things they should have done on tour, things they should have done to market themselves, like any way they could have stepped up on their own. What would you have wanted them to do?
I mean, again, it would just be, stay together is the number one thing. But as
Yeah, but
far as
that's the core of it. But like there's always something like, hey guys, when you're at or band members when you're at the table, don't just fucking sit there. Like go talk to people, hand these out.
yeah, no, that's, yes, go try to be as look at their bands. It's fun being in a band, and you're not supposed to just be in a band to be in a business. That's no fun,
Yep.
especially when you're 21 years old. But at the same time, look at every single show as an opportunity to build your name in that place. I would have so many bands that would tour, and maybe their first time in a spot, they would play to a dozen people or 2 or 3 dozen people, and they could literally make it their mission to get every single person's email address in that place and maybe their phone number.
It's a
They can make it their
great idea.
mission
Yep.
to be friends with those people. And so the first time there was 30 people, but the next time there's 70 people, and the next time there's 150 people. And that's the way successful bands do it. And a lot of bands, like you said, they just hang out at the merch table, or they hang out in their van, or they hang out with the other bands, which also is really important, obviously, hanging out with the other bands. But I think that just looking at the band a little bit more like a business.
I mean, you have to. I mean, you can't sit there and bitch at a label about not giving enough money or being able to support you and then say, but we're not a business. It's like, asshole. What drives that is money. So if you're not going to help support it, like it's like you gotta say it is a business. Like a business doesn't have to be so cold. It can be fun,
Right.
and you could do fun things. But yeah, I loved how you said make it their mission, because if you had one goal and say, all right, guys, like on this tour or every show we do, we have to at least go up to every single person and just ask for their email, or just give a sticker or something that becomes almost like, this is just like the business part of me like talking now, but there's some metric where it's like, okay, this sounds a little too cold, but it's like, but the business thing, but here's the benefit is that now you're going to meet someone new who might not have listened to your set or liked your set and wanted to tell you was afraid to, but now they see you're a person, now they're going to like you even more. So that's the personal benefit of that, because you're actually going to build relationships that way. But
Yeah.
this other thing is going to keep you in front of them, where all these other bands out there that are touring around, they show up and think like everyone's going to remember us. They're like, no, they're not. You need to stay in front of them as much as possible, and you need to give back as much as possible. And your emails you sent out can be really cool and fun, and that's another way to like communicate with them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, totally. I mean, that's something that is logical, but so many bands and band members in bands. I mean, there's always like the one guy in the band, right? Who's the business guy, and
Yeah.
then the other guys are not the business guy. And the bands I think that really truly succeeded were bands that not only like had more than one business guy, like everyone actually pulled their weight, but I mean, there's nothing wrong with having a manager. I'm not, anti-manager for a band at that time, but if you have a label, if you have a team around you, I mean, there are plenty of bands. Look, like Hawthorne Heights sent me their demo before they signed to Victory. It was awful.
I never liked that band. I never liked
Arguably,
that band.
arguably the first record. A lot of people think that's awful, but it sold, over 500,000 records
I never
or
got it.
something like that. But the point is that if I'd signed that band and put them out, it wouldn't have sold the same amount, because Victory had a different kind of
Well, their reach was
network,
fucking
money,
crazy.
reach,
Yeah.
everything, and so much of it was getting on tours and getting on the right tours. A lot of that was controlled by managers and booking agents. And it's like, if you're a booking agent and you have, let's say 6 bands on your roster, and you work for a booking agency company where there's 6 agents, well, that's 36 bands. Now, are you going to have a negative progression band open your tour, even if the headlining band is friends with them? Or are you, as a booking agent, do you have a financial interest in keeping all that money in house at your booking agency overall? That's what happens. That's what happened at the time. So that's why you would have so many of the same tours, because all those bands were like, oh, well, I've got this baby band, booking agent 1 that works for this booking agency. They're going to put them on tour with this other agent in their same company and build. And that's how it all happened. So it sort of was very difficult for bands on a label like mine to break into that. And like a lot of the bands I had on my label knew a ton of bands and were friends with a ton of bands, and those bands liked my bands, and I knew them and they liked me, and I knew the booking agents and managers, but it's just not necessarily in the financial interest. I mean, why do you think all the drive-through bands toured together, right?
Ah, I didn't even think about that.
It's all about money.
Well, yeah, I mean, it it's a fine line. It's a balance between money and art. And when like the struggling artist, when people complain about like I don't make money, it's like, well, yeah, but I love the punk rock ethics, and I still like, for me, I try to incorporate the DIY thing, or try to have some kind of keeping things like the not sell out approach, or the punk thing. That's definitely stays in the back of my mind when I do certain things with any of the things that I do. But there's a part where that shit just doesn't pay the fucking bills. And
Yeah.
so it's like you can't bitch about not having money when you're doing so much to push it away from you.
Yeah.
or not doing enough
Yeah.
to drive it towards you, you know? So it's a funny thing of the what's being put out in front of people is this CD that has a heart and soul to it and these songs that we all connect with. The shitty part is that underneath all that is just like gears that are turning because that's how it got to you.
Yeah.
So it's like you can't dismiss that because that also is beneficial because it got you there. So you got to find that nice balance of, all right, well, we could be artsy and have punk ethics, but we also have to eat. So we don't have to do it in a devious way. It's like value for value. We make shit, people buy it, and that should be fine.
I agree, but it's just one of those things where when you're thinking about, because you asked me what could a band do to grow faster at that time.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it's impossible because plenty of bands took out their friends' bands, but I think that the current is swimming downstream when a band was more likely to get on a tour with a band that was managed by the same manager or on the same label or booked by the same booking agent. And sure, some bigger bands took out smaller bands that they were friends with that were on a small label or weren't on a label, but I think that's swimming upstream. I don't think that happened that often or often enough.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that I didn't necessarily like about how the scene changed in the 2000s versus the 90s, because it was just less. I mean, it sounds so cheesy, but it was less corporate.
Yeah. What kind of criteria did you have to get a band on your label?
I mean, the number one criteria to be on Negative Progression is that I love your songs, love your record. That was the first thing, and I think any label will tell you that. I often, wanted to see a band touring a little bit. I wanted to see how they were doing locally. I mean, your podcast is kind of Jersey centric, right? So, or tri-state centric or whatnot. So I had a lot of bands. I mean, I put out a number of bands from Jersey, June Spirit, The Progress, John Connor. I put out The Goodwill from Long Island, Five Drivers from Pennsylvania. Am I missing anyone
Well, Over It.
from that area? Over It was from Virginia. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't really consider that kind of in that same
Yeah, that's
area,
true.
but like, I think Aberdeen actually was a band also from Virginia, the same area. But I think that those areas were so filled with great bands that I also got a lot of demos from other bands from the tri-state area that I thought were good, but for one reason or another, this sounds so terrible, but I just didn't think they were good enough to be on, to get that stamp.
I mean, it's your brand, man. I mean, it's got
Yeah.
to match.
I mean, just like there were bands, like I almost signed Midtown before they signed a drive through.
Yeah, talk about that. You said that in your email. What was that whole story? Because you also put on a show with them in Boston, and then
Yeah.
talk about that.
So like I had a friend. Well, Litmonger played a show in Jersey with Humble Beginnings when Gabe was in the band, so I was familiar with them. Then I had a very close friend in college, Rob Sunderman, and he was really close friends from growing up with Tyler. When they did their demo, Rob gave me the demo, and he was just like really into it. That became the first EP, and I was at that time trying to bring New Jersey bands up, and I knew Gabe had been in Humble Beginnings and stuff. And so I was booking shows. So I booked a show, I believe, and I'm sure Heath will remember this, but I think it was their third show. I think it was their third show. So, and they stayed at my house. I'm trying to remember what the show, I think it was like, it could have been in Jersey. I think it was like Weston, Adam and His Package, Autopilot Off, and I think Midtown played second or something like that, and
Okay.
maybe someone else, maybe a Massachusetts band to open or something like that. It was at BU. I think that was the show at BU that got shut. It got shut down. There were too many people that went there, and it was over capacity, so it got shut down, and the show didn't get completed. But so they stayed at my house, and I really loved them and really wanted to sign the band, but they had already verbally agreed to be on drive-through. They hadn't signed anything, but they had made a verbal commitment to Richard. And so, Gabe basically was like, look, I wish, I mean, that's the way I remember it anyways. Maybe that's just a little, silver lining, but he pretty much was like, I have to honor my commitments,
He's like, look, man, I know you're the greatest record label of all time. You're like, that's how I remember it.
No, I mean, I get along really well with those guys, and I really like those guys. And so I think, and it was also a memorable show because it got shut down. It was like so full. And to be perfectly honest, I actually set it up we had a club on campus that I started with my ex-girlfriend called the Substance Free Coalition, which was like basically straight edge kids doing good, clean, fun activities, which sounds so nerdy. But we put on a couple shows, and I basically was supposed to, I think, hire security guards or do some formal, thing, because it was at Boston University, and I didn't do that because I'm so punk rock. And
Nice.
and pretty much like halfway into the show, like security showed up and they're like, do you have these forms? And we were like, no, we don't, shit. And everyone kind of like scattered, and it was kind of crazy. I think that was that show. Everything was a little on the fly in those days. Oh, but then I think you're probably asking, like, a couple months later, the band or some of the band members came out to Boston again. They were staying at my house, and Gabe mentioned, he was like, oh, before we put out something on drive-through, would you be interested in doing a 7-inch, like a split 7-inch? Like, we have this really, we're friends with this band that's playing. They're just kind of starting out. They're playing in like, basements in Jersey. They're called Thursday. And like, we could do a split 7-inch with them, like on Negative Progression, if you would be interested. And I'm like, yeah, I don't do vinyl anymore. I was like, I did that the first couple releases, and I don't know. I don't really think people buy vinyl. I really only do CDs. And yeah, that was, I mean, I don't know if that was a legit like offer or if it was just some idea he had. I don't know if it was like he talked to Thursday or not, but I don't stuff like that happened to me all the time. Like when I was in,
Well, that's what I was gonna ask. Like, what other instances did that happen? Like, wait, let me word this right. And what other times did something like that happen?
so many times. I mean, so many times I got bands that I wanted to sign that ended up signing to bigger labels. I mean, like I really wanted to sign to Junior Varsity, who ended up on Victory. Like I met, when I was in Litmonger, Matt Watts from the Starting Line went to University of Hartford, and I met him and Kenny, and their band at that time was called Sunday Drive, and they gave me a demo, and it was so good. And they were quickly on drive through. And like in Boston, I don't know if you remember the band Jericho. I guess they changed their name, Jericho RVA or something like that.
Okay.
They were on Fat Records, and I really wanted to sign them, and I took them, we were good buddies, and I took them to buy their first van. And like I put on the first couple shows in Boston proper for Smack and Isaiah, who became Wilhelm Scream, and I really wanted to sign them. There's just there were just so many bands that happened to, but there were a number of bands that I passed on, that like Hidden in Plain View, they sent me their record and I wasn't super into it, kind of a thing at that time. But I ended up signing John Connor, who was Jay Snyder, who was in Hidden in Plain View. I put out his record for John Connor.
Yeah, because I was going through the list of all the records on your Bandcamp page, and there was, I remember I know we talked about them, but like Counterfeit, I remember that name from back then. For some reason, I thought they were like a ska band. I don't know why.
The opposite of a ska band.
Yeah, there was I don't know what the fuck I'm thinking of who I'm mixing them up with. But no, there's actually, well, because then I started listening to some of the songs on the Bandcamp page, and that song From Finish to Starting Line.
Yeah.
That song's fucking awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
I like that song. I just like randomly, I just went down and was like, oh, this. I was like, fuck, this is really good. Like, what year did they put that song out?
From Finish, the starting line was from their first EP, and that was 2001.
Wow, that shit holds up. Damn.
Yeah, no, they're everything from the EP and full length that I put out is awesome, just tremendous.
So is the label still around, or is it like?
No,
Because
no,
sometimes like a label will take like a very long time, but they'll say like, oh, we didn't really turn the lights off, like we still exist, but we just don't do anything anymore.
I occasionally, if I see a cool band, I get a little bit of an itch, and then I also think about like all of my experiences, and I sort of realize that was a certain time in music. The scene is just so different now, and obviously during COVID, it's like totally over right now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the whole. I don't personally know, and I asked a couple people like I actually signed a couple bands that I didn't end up putting out their records and ended up selling or giving it to someone else just because or the band broke up before I put it out. Like I signed this band DeSoto Jones from the Philly area. They're a really great band, and they ended up signing with Deep Elm.
Oh wow.
And at that point, I was just sort of like they got that offer, and I was like, you know what? I've been fighting with bands too much. Go ahead. And but like they're in a new band. There's a couple members of that band and like someone from the June Spirit, and isn't they're in a new band. And gosh, off the top of my head, I'm blanking on what they're called, but it's pretty good. Sometimes I get an email from someone like that's been in a band of mine in the past that's in a new band, or like Craig from One Way Letter in Atlanta is in a new band that's a really cool emo band. Also, I can't remember the name. I asked them, I'm like, a band today, what would a band today need from a label? Like,
Yeah.
what exactly would a band need? And I don't know, just money. I don't know. Gabe Supporter one time told me that all a label is a bank and a marketing agency, and I thought that was so horrible at the time. I was just that was like the most like cold-hearted shit I had ever heard at that time.
When
but
you said
it's
that though, I was like, yep.
but it's kind of true, you know. I mean, and it's somewhat true in some way. It depends how you run the label, right? It just depends what kind of label you want. I don't know what a band, because I want to get back. Like, I'm trying to play music still. I play drums, and I still am trying to jam with people and have fun. I spent so many years just like helping other bands, so I would really like to play with other people, but haven't found the right match so far.
Where are you living right now?
I live in Orlando again. Yeah.
So everyone listening, if you live in Orlando and you're looking for a drummer, um,
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just,
I was
just connect stuff.
actually. Thank you. I appreciate it. In Litmonger, I played drums and bass for different times, not the same show, obviously.
That's like some sicko shit there.
Yeah.
Or which
Yeah.
band? I know which
Exactly.
bands did that. Yeah.
But then, like, I also in the past I've also I played drums. I played drums in a band called Breaker Breaker that was briefly on. We put out one record on Bridge 9. So
Oh wow.
I occasionally dabble, but I
Bring
don't
out the
think putting out
skins.
records. Yeah, I don't know if putting out records is. I have no idea how people make any money doing that.
Yeah, like Rob Hit, he just put out for I Surrender Records, his record label. He just put out the new I Am the Avalanche record,
Okay.
and it's a mix of digital and vinyl. Yeah, man, I don't know. Like I did a present. I was a couple years ago. I was doing a presentation. There was this creative center. It's a block from me in Raleigh, and it was really cool. And they just shut down permanently. They also were struggling before all this shit, which sucks. But it was like a cool spot, and you could do like a what is that? Like you teach someone for an hour. God, what the hell is that called? I forget what it's. It's like a little class. So I would talk to bands about how to market themselves. And I would sit there for about an hour and a half and say, like, this is all the shit that I see that you guys have in your possession. And here's the kind of video. I was like, what was it, like 20 ways to market your band for free with your phone. And it was a blast because I'm like, there's so much you can do to get your name out there. Now, the financial ways I was like, that I don't know. I mean, you could do a Patreon where you just do Q&As or release songs behind the wall. Like, you can get creative, but that's how the band makes money. As far as the label goes, fuck, man. I mean, Jeff Kish, I mean, he works for Universal Group, and that's his full-time job. I'm like, how does any label make any money during all this? I've just no fucking idea.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I mean,
Like
I
vinyl,
think that
yeah, vinyl does
I,
sell nowadays.
I mean, it's just like there's a label. Well, do you remember Smartpunk?
Yeah.
So Smartpunk like still technically exists in a different form. It's a label now, and it was purchased from, so like Smartpunk was owned by Bob Becker from Fearless, and then it was
Oh,
purchased
I didn't know that.
by this company. There's a cool merch company here in Orlando called AKT, and they do a lot of band shirts and stuff, and a bunch of my punk rock friends work there, and they years ago purchased the rights to Smartpunk from Fearless, and they started it up. So Smartpunk Records exists, and they put out records. They put out runs of like, 300 or
Yeah.
150 or 200 or something, and they're like, oh, we sold out the pressing. And I mean, we used to put out pressings of like 2, 3, 4,000 as the first pressing, and it's just a totally different universe. And it reminds me a lot. You watch these old videos on YouTube of like, Fat Mike or somebody from like Lookout Records or Mike Park or someone talking about what it was like to be in a band or run a label in the early 90s or the 80s. And it's like, you're not trying to make money because you don't have any chance of making money. You're just in a band because it's fun.
Mm.
And I mean, Fugazi didn't even have a shirt. The famous Fugazi shirt is a bootleg. Like, that's not even, they didn't even put out that shirt.
Oh, that's funny.
And so like, I think the scene is just going back to that. I mean, people are always going to want to play music. It's fun, and it's fun to sing along. It's fun to be in a sweaty basement or a garage or backyard. Um,
Yeah.
but I don't necessarily think people are going to start labels to make money. I mean, I mostly was able to sign bands because I could help them with things they didn't have, which was marketing,
And a bank.
recording, and a bank. Yeah, exactly. Gabe Saporta, 101. um, but it
That's
is
funny.
it is it is what it is, right? I mean, in a way, that might be better for the scene to kind of revert away from this whole Warped Tour universe that some people would argue that the whole like screamo neon thing that was happening whenever that was 10 years ago or something was kind of like the apex of the worst part of punk rock.
I'll agree with that.
you know I mean, I like
There
some of
was
those bands.
no, I definitely love some screamo bands like Norma Jean or Glassjaw or Chariot. Like I like the ones that I thought did it well. It was the ones that did it horribly. They screamed for no reason in certain parts and was like, you didn't really need to do that. You just did that because it's popular and it's like it just crushed this song. Like that was my take on it. I just thought that again, in some bands there was a crowd that wanted it and they did well and that's great. But I mean, just my outside perspective, I was like, I'm not gonna go pay for that shit.
The thing that was the worst, and to be fair, I put out a couple of those bands, and I really love the ones that I put out. The Subtle Way is a band that I would recommend everyone listen to that likes that kind of stuff. But like, Old Thrice or that kind of universe,
Yeah,
Poison the Well, stuff like that.
yeah.
Um,
Poison was really good.
but but like the worst was when you go to these shows at that time, and they were like all the Rise Records bands, and I like Craig, who ran that label, and I knew him a long time ago, and no diss on him. He made a lot of money. Good for him. But some of those bands, when they started doing those choreographed dances, and they were like running in place and like acting like they were like driving motorcycles or something while they were playing. I don't know. It was just, they all like were doing the same things, and it was just god awful.
Well, Rise is still a label.
Oh, really?
Yeah, dude, he's got. I thought I was like, I know this sounds familiar. I mean, I'm on the website. Yeah, he put the new Out the Driving out.
Yeah.
Yeah, he put the new Out the Driving out. Angels and Airwaves. Like this seems like they've done. Yeah, Pups on that. Pups really good. But yeah, man. I mean, again, it's all about. I'm. I've said many times about records where people will say this record's great. I was like, this record's shit. Not meaning that it's shit like all together. It just where it hit me, it just ricocheted. And I can also look at things and be like, I get why people dig it, and I'm gonna, then you can also get into just that friendly conversation with friends where you're like, your taste is crap. It's like,
Yeah.
it's all good and fun, but if someone likes something, like, I appreciate that they like it. But I thought back in the day when these things were coming out and like the choreographed dance things, and there was one band, it was like Five Brothers, and it was like a disco punk thing, and I just saw that and I was like, this is so. And these guys looked like they were like in their 50s, and
Oh boy.
it just looked like they were just saw opportunity and went for it, and it just like you could see it for what it was, and that's the shit that bothered me. It was like this is killing something that wasn't meant to be so like it, I don't know, just watered down or just sugar, whatever the fuck they did to it at these bands, and I was like, eh. But again, that's just my take. Again, people probably from the 80s or early 90s looked at the late 90s, early 2000s scene, and they were just like, this is shit. This is crap. We fucking
Yeah.
hate this. So it's always going to have that. It's always going to come in waves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always easy to judge things in hindsight,
Totally.
but I mean, it's just I don't know how anyone would approach being in a band other than just being authentic. And I think that's to me what it comes down to is that authenticity. And it's like back in the day when we were talking about all these bands that are now classic bands coming up, you would have shows, at least in New England, with, a hardcore band, an emo band, like 10-Yard Fight, Piebald, and Converge would play together
Yeah.
like all the time, and everyone would just love it, every single one of those bands. Or the same people that would go see like Floor Punch or Blood for Blood, well, maybe not Blood for Blood, but Floor Punch would go see The Promise Ring or Get Up Kids or something.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think that was really special at that time, and that was really cool. But I think that also part of it, I mean, this sounds like a crusty old man, but I think that as the punk scene got bigger and bigger, and as there was more opportunity to become a bigger band or make more money, the bands themselves got lazier because there were other people doing stuff for them that they previously would have had to do themselves. And there was like no possibility to do XYZ in 1998, where in 2008 the sky was the limit. And so like I would have bands that were, you know, that would be awesome, and I would put out a record for them, and then they would be like, oh yeah, we're going on a tour of New Jersey, or oh, we're going on a tour. It's a 3-day tour. It's these 3 towns in Northern California. And I'm just thinking like, damn, that's not a tour, buddy. And that's just a weekend. You don't need to make a laminate and create some sort of art for your 3-day tour of like Western Pennsylvania,
A
you know?
laminate. Oh, that's funny.
And so that, I just found, unfortunately, I had a few bands towards the end that I thought were like so talented, and they had stuff going for them, but they just didn't play enough. They didn't tour. They just wrote great records and then just kind of played a few times locally at their, where they were comfortable and weren't really like striving to get anything.
Well, again,
They didn't.
man, it comes down to like we were talking before. There was that we we deserve this because other bands in our genre are getting this. So we want to fast forward through the 5 to 7 years or maybe 10 years that that band that I'm talking about took to get to that spot. And some bands didn't take that long, but some bands earned their way. And then someone goes, well, I want to just skip ahead to where you are. And you're like, well, you don't get to do that. So you got to
Yeah.
start in the front of the line or the back of the line. And then they're like, well, I don't want to do that. And you're like, well, here we are. You know, like,
Yeah.
I don't really know what to tell you right now because time, you got to put in your dues. You got to write songs that are good. You got to find the audience that likes your songs and then just go after them. It's a weird balance.
Well, what do you think? I'm curious what you think about, as a marketing person, this whole the phenomenon of some bands like having crazy YouTube plays on their videos versus like not many people coming out to their shows, because or not a million people coming out. I don't want to diss anyone, but
Yeah.
for example, I put out a metal band or a hardcore band in I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, called Dennis is Dead, and they were from California, and they hadn't really, they didn't really tour, and they were a really good band. I really enjoyed I always enjoyed talking to them and hanging out with them. They toured a little bit. They didn't tour, not at all, but they actually were one of these bands, had a really bad van accident. But the drummer is a filmmaker. And at the time he was in film school. And so he made, like, their first video was a really cool video. And I was able to do the premiere on Blank TV, which was, a thing at one point. And, it has like 500,000 plays or something crazy. And that didn't translate to significantly more people at their shows at all. Like, I mean, some more people came, but not a ton.
I think of it like this. You have to create an experience and more like a tribe. This is very Seth Godin, where you can have a million play, or like 500,000 plays, million plays, whatever it is for a video, and that's one experience. I think there's a couple of reasons why people don't go out. One, people are just fucking lazy. Unless you're hitting them, you could see a video and think it's really cool. Like, I've seen those OK Go videos.
Yeah.
They're fantastic. I have never fucking spent any money to go see them play live. Because
Well, why do you think that is?
I think the videos are great. I also think that they're not going to be able to redo that live. And the song is good, but the visual is what I like. The song isn't what I love. Like, the Here We Go song is great. It's catchy, but there's no emotional attachment that I have to that band where I'm like, I will drive 40 minutes. And now for me, it's like, being in my 40s, I'm very particular about my fucking time. So I'm like, if I have to drive more than like 20 minutes, if that, to go do something, I'm like, I'm good. I also live in a city and I can walk around. So that's me personally. But unless I feel like I'm part of that tribe, or like I'm cranking those songs, I won't give any attention to it. But like Balance and Composure, which I've talked about a bunch of times, I fucking love that band, and
Yeah, they're
I've
great.
gone out of my way to see them many times. And I've bought like I've I mean, obviously, I used to buy their CDs. I bought their music on iTunes. I got their second to last record on vinyl recently. Um, like, there's just certain connections that I have with someone, but I think if you put something out and it's like having a million views doesn't give you a million followers, just gave you 2 million eyes. And there's it's like you got to stay in front of them consistently. If you get those people to follow your Instagram, to get in your email list, to buy your shit or constantly listen, and you give them a reason to stay with you because of the length of your band, you can't be like, whoa, we just kind of do shit and people listen to it and we just do our thing. It's like you gotta, the day one of the band to the last day of the band, you gotta create a room that's gonna house all of your fans and do as much as possible to keep them there and make them want to fucking see you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is, I mean, what I'm hearing is that it still comes down to that connection, the personal connection with the music. I mean,
Always.
there's everyone that likes this kind of music has had at least one, if not dozens of experiences where you're seeing a band you love and you're just feeling it in your heart, in your gut, your soul, whatever. And you just are having an otherworldly experience. I mean, I like hardcore as well. I mean, I've seen Bane a million times, and it was mostly because of the live show. Like, I hardly ever listen to Bane recorded ever. It's just like that experience of being at a show, or Converge, or those kinds of bands.
Yeah.
But
I
that's
actually,
what it is to me.
I think now that I think about it more after pausing, I said it earlier, and I've said it in other episodes. The thing that intrigued me about bands back in the day, because there was nothing out there, and you had to go see them. I almost think that if bands are going to do videos nowadays, make it a mystery. Don't let people know what you look like.
Yeah.
Tool did that back in the day for all their videos. They never showed up. I mean, Christ, they even do it their stage show now, which I think is fucking stupid. Um, I really used to love Tool. Just the fact that like Maynard just like hides behind the curtains. I guess it's his artistic thing. I think it's like if I'm gonna pay money, I don't want to see a fucking shadow or like a
Yeah.
display.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
that, there's a mystery there that if I saw them live or I see them play, it's like okay, I see them. I don't have to go do that. I got that. I scratched that itch. But if you make it a mystery and make it intriguing and get their attention emotionally through video, but don't give them too much. It's like you can't give everybody, you can't give them everything in one shot, and I think that might be the thing that fucks it for people.
People emphasize the video stuff, the technology stuff, and when it comes down to it with this kind of music, punk rock, hardcore, pop punk, whatever, it is really personal, and I think that's what makes people love it, so intensely, is because it's like that personal connection with the band, with the music, being at that show where everyone's packed in and your ears are blasted and you're like literally holding the cymbal stand from falling down,
Right.
when your favorite band is playing.
Yeah.
I think that's what kept me putting out records for like 16 years. But the thing that's cool is that a lot of the bands that I put out, I was able to have that feeling and experience that feeling when I saw them and when I listened to their record. And it was exciting for me to be part of like sharing that feeling with other people. I think that's why I did it, because I I felt that way, and I wanted to help other people feel that way, because I'm like, I wrote down a list of all of my bands right next to me just for reference while we're on this call.
Yeah.
And I'm just looking at every one of these bands, remembering like a different show that I went to, or remembering, oh yeah, this band was really hot, and then they had a change of singer, and then that changed the experience for people and me, or whatever, that kind of a thing, or they changed their guitar player, or I remember this show, or like how I told you, when I first went and met Over It, I was like staying at Nick's house, and it was just like such a cool experience. Or Contender was a band from Denver, and I sent in that email that like when I was living in California, they were on tour in like near Oregon in California, and their van engine literally exploded. Um, and my girlfriend at the time had to drive up and pick them up and bring them down to Oakland. So it's just there's so many cool memories, and I just know I'm still in touch with a lot of members of a lot of my bands. There so many of them, I feel so lucky to have met them. We still have a lot in common, and we have that history. I think everyone that has been in the punk scene, like for a significant period of time, has a connection, whether it's like the same experience with different shows, or we all know what it's like to be in a band, or we all know what it's like to put on a show, or have friends or whatever who have had those experiences, or like stay at your house. You go to a show. I don't know. One time I went and saw Discount, and I was just like in Massachusetts somewhere, and I was like, oh, do you have anywhere to stay tonight? Because I just generally did that when I would go see bands, because I knew what it's like touring, and you don't want to sleep in your van if possible. And they stayed at my
Yeah.
house, and like now I don't really care, but I know that Alison Mosshart is kind of like hot shit somebody.
Yeah, she's like really popular with her
Yeah.
band now, right? I found
Yeah.
out. Yeah,
So
yeah.
I mean, it's just funny how all those things kind of connect. It's all sort of
Well, I mean, it's like when you're starting something, you have to have like a finite focus of what's your mission, and that's really what you have to go back to. I always thought that shit was stupid when I would go into businesses or whatever, and they're like, "Here's our mission statement." I was like, "What the fuck
yeah.
does that mean? That's some crap." But I've seen businesses where they're like, "We do this," and they make it a sentence. Like the whole purpose of this podcast, it's one sentence. It's a podcast with the late '90s, early 2000s scene. In the beginning, it was the Jersey scene, and then it branched out to the
Yeah.
scene. In that sentence, it defines everything. If someone reaches out to me and they're like, "Hey, we want to be on the podcast," I'm like, "Did you start in the early '90s or the mid '90s?" And they're like, "No, we started in like 2005." I was like, "It's a clear no because it doesn't go along with what I want to talk about unless they said, well, I played in this one band from like the late '90s." I'm like, "There we
Yeah.
go." So it's like, and that's my mission statement is just to talk about that time. Like I never post photos of like myself. It's like I don't make this about me. It's about the scene is the thing I'm
Yeah,
presenting,
yeah,
right? And it's like anything I post about on Instagram or online, it's about that error. And sometimes I'll like sneak in and be like, hey, I have an animation company or I have like a comic. It's like trying to get some kind of benefit out of this for me, like
sure.
financially. But the most of it is like, yo, here's a video of fucking Less Than Jake playing in a New Jersey Legion Hall back in 96 or 94 or whatever it was. Or here's this band. Or if it's like a band from back in the day, they're doing something new. It's like, oh, this band from back then, they're doing this now. So there's always a connection to that, but it goes back to that thing. So I think as like a mission statement of what you're doing, it's like it sounds like for you, it was I just wanted to do it. What every single thing you just set up to leading to me cutting you off was your mission statement, and
I guess so.
yeah. But it's like it's hard to do that and say like, yeah, but I spent so much money and there was no return. It's like, well, then that should have been part of your mission statement.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the thing too. That's like crazy thinking back. If let's say, like, I know I've mentioned Fat Mike a bunch of times, but I was just watching this video, and Fat Mike is talking about 30 records on Fat that he loves or whatever.
Oh yeah,
And
I
there was
thought
a
that was
record put
great.
out by the band Snuff from England, and I actually saw that band open for Bouncing Souls and No Effects, like when I lived in Atlanta in like '95 or something. And I guess that had been a band that was broken up, and they formed another band, Guns and Wankers, that was on Fat. And Mike was like, oh, I want to put out that Snuff record, even though it was a broken up band. And they're like, no, I don't think so. He's like, oh, how about I give you $50,000 to record the record? And I'm just thinking, like, that is so crazy to me,
Wow.
because that's so much money. And like, think about, let's say, $10,000 recording budget back then. You've got like someone like me or someone else who ran a label similar to mine size wise, and you're saying, okay, well, let's say the recording is $10,000 and you got to press, records, and then you have to got to do the marketing and da da da. So what are you talking about? $25,000, and then you're going to put out 4 records a year. You're talking about $100,000, and you're like, okay, yeah, you're 23 and you work at Kinko's. How are you going to do that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what the scene was like back then.
Yeah.
And it's just crazy. But it is so cool that so many people that were involved in the scene have gone on to do other really neat things. I think it drew certain personality types together that got along really well,
Oh,
because
totally.
I mean, some people
Absolutely.
have become like producers, some people have become graphic designers. Obviously, other people have gone on to be in other bands and, marketing people. And I mean, I just feel more connected to people that have come out of the scene probably than anyone else I encounter. Like the second I get, in a room with someone who you can feel that vibe, or a little bit about them, you just like click.
Totally. Yeah. If I know that someone, and I'm going to wrap this up, but if I know that someone was involved in the scene back in the day, it's almost like they're fucking family. I'll be like,
Yeah.
let's just go and geek the fuck. I mean, Christ, I do this for like a couple times a week for about almost 2 hours with people. It's
Yeah.
like, luckily, I record it and share it, but this whole thing is just like people remembering things. And granted, there's marketing conversations that randomly come up because that's just then I'm intrigued by that. But there's that criteria of, oh wow, you used to go shows back then. And then there's the other criteria of just someone loving music. There's a girl who works at a coffee shop down the street, and she's been playing when I go there. So every Saturday I go to this coffee shop and I edit the podcast for like 4 hours. And every time I walk in, if she's working, she's always playing like Balance and Composure or Tiger's Jaw. Or
Oh, nice.
the other day I walked in and she was working and it sounded newer and I knew it. She put it on. I was like, "What is this?" She was, "Oh, it's this band called Author." And I would like immediately went in my car and started listening to it and put some of their songs on my Spotify playlist just to check them out. So if anyone loves music or likes or plays the bands that I like, I'm automatically like, oh my God, you're the coolest person ever, because obviously I have the best taste in music. So we met there. But yeah, there is that like connection thing. But if someone tells me, "Oh, I listen to everything," I'm like, "Ugh, God, I hate that answer." Like,
Yeah.
don't tell me that
Yeah.
shit. This
Yeah.
shit didn't
Yeah.
affect your soul or, you know. your life. It's the worst
Yeah, that
answer.
I do miss that. I definitely miss that. Like I I do get nostalgic for that time, and I do think that it was a special time in music, and I feel really lucky to have been involved in it at that time. And I used to love. I don't know if you were a big fan of so many zines, but like, Paste Punk and punkrocks.net and Absolute Punk and Punk
Hmm.
News. Those places were just really really great websites to kind of
Keep you up to
connect
date
us
or
all.
something.
Connect us
Yeah.
all.
Oh, totally. Like absolute punk. That one I would go to a lot. I did hear Interpunk. They had some crazy shit go down with them where they like were stealing money or something. Did you hear about that?
What?
Yeah, it
No.
was. I heard it. I think I heard it on Brennan Kelly's podcast. It was somewhere, and I posted in the New Jersey Pop Punk Facebook group, and I was like, "Is this accurate?" And I forget where the conversation went, but someone was like, "Yeah, like the person running it was buying crack or something." I mean, I can completely be totally fucking doing this wrong, but they were like embezzling money or something. So there's a lot of bands that were owed money that didn't get it because they,
Oh, that's too bad.
yeah. So I think there was like a documentary coming out about it or something. I
I
don't
mean,
know.
shit like that happened so often. Like, I don't know if you remember the story of like Lumberjack distribution and Mordem distribution.
I remember the name. I know of the name. It's almost like Caroline is like the name
So
synonymous.
basically, like, Mordem was Lookout Records distributor, and so they were kind of like a cool record distributor. I always wanted to be distributed by them. I ended up getting distributed by Lumberjack, which was owned by the guy Dirk, who owned Doghouse Records.
Yeah.
And Doghouse, or I guess Lumberjack, purchased Mordem, and through some like unknown financial means, like the whole thing ended up exploding, and a bunch of labels that were distributed by it got totally screwed, some out of tens of thousands of dollars.
Jesus.
It's not surprising when you hear stories about Victory and like that Lumberjack story, and what you just mentioned about Interpunk. And
There's always gonna be a wolf in the hen house, man. Like
yeah, I mean,
sometimes.
sometimes stuff just goes south and somebody makes a bad decision, I think.
Well, I think a lot of people that were doing these things too, they didn't have a business degree. They started it off and like, let me figure out how to do this. And then they either had really good ethics and they're like, I'm going to have good ethics with this, or they had real shit ethics and they're like, I'm gonna just totally rip the fuck off of everything and be a bad person. I think that
Well, and
was
also
rare, but
how many small businesses like fail, right? Like, look at how many restaurants fail, look at how many bars fail. I mean, to a certain extent, I think we in our scene, like, I'm not saying that we should excuse bad behavior or past bad behavior, but like, to a certain extent, like, obviously there's going to be some people who aren't great at their business
oh,
and make a
totally.
mistake, and their business goes out of business because they're not good at it. I mean,
Yeah.
if you watch any of these like home flipping shows or bar rescue or whatever, I mean, man, it's hard to make a business succeed.
Yeah, again, someone goes, I'm really good at cooking. I'm going to open a business, and now I have to have employees and do bookkeeping and all of this and have marketing. They're like, no, I was just really good at cooking this certain dish. I've seen that happen with CrossFits. Like, I was big, I've been doing that shit for like 10 years on and off, and I've seen people who were really big into, they were a coach or they were going there and then became a coach, and they're like, "Oh, I got this." And then they open up one and they're like, "Oh my God, I have to teach every class starting at 5 a.m. until 7 o'clock at night." And they would just run it into the ground because they didn't know fucking
Yeah.
business.
Or sometimes they're good at it and it's going well for a couple of years, and then something changes in their life and they're cutting corners somewhere, and then it tanks.
Yeah, it's really hard to do a business, and having a record label is that. It's wearing every single hat and trying to figure that shit out on the fly, and either you you're smart about it and you get help. Like for me, I've gotten business coaches and sales training and shit over the years because I was like, I don't know this crap. Like
Yeah.
I'll drop some money to learn it, and now I can be organized, or I can hire a little, a bookkeeper or something to unfuck everything I've done. But yeah. So on that note,
Yeah, exactly. That's a good ending point.
that's a great positive way to end
on,
this.
on fuck everything I've done.
Yeah, that's why I
Well,
don't
thank
yeah.
you. Thank you very much for interviewing me. And it's just been nice to chat about this time, and I appreciate it. And obviously, if you ever want to chat, even, not on the podcast or whatever, feel free to hit me up, text me, and we'll reminisce.
Yeah, man, I definitely I try it's like I feel so bad because I'll interview people and then I just kind of lose touch with them, but I'll sometimes find ways to just be like, "Hey, check this out," or like try to text, but I feel so bad sometimes because it's like I'll interview people and I hope that they don't think that I just was like, "All right, cool, I interviewed you, that's it." It's like I want to be friends with like everyone I've interviewed with, and it's like
Sure.
sometimes I just don't have enough fucking time to, you know, keep up to date and stuff like that, but
Well, you
yeah.
can add a Counterfeit song to your favorite playlist, and every time you hear that, you can think of me.
I'd say a text, just like a picture of Spotify. I'd be like, "Look, I'm making you no money right now." Spotify.
Yeah, that's okay. I feel lucky to have been, somehow involved in these great records.
Yeah, man. No, it's awesome. It's cool you got to experience that. All right, so I'm gonna
Cool.
end this with two questions. One, what would you like to plug?
What would I like to plug? I would like everyone to go to Bandcamp and listen to all the records on Negative Progression Records Bandcamp. Not because I really get any money out of it, but because I really love the bands and love the records, and I hope everyone else does too.
I would ask you and say like, what's the best song on there? But that's like saying to like a parent, like, who's your favorite child, and say it in front of them right now. You know?
Yeah, that's impossible. But I will say, like I told you, records that are on the Bandcamp, I put together 3 different themed comps, because I put out some records that were emo, some records that were pop punk, and some that were heavier.
Oh,
And so I made 3 themed comps. So one is it's a negative progression summer. Another is it's a negative progression autumn, I think, and the third is like it's a negative progression winter. And so listening to each one of those, you can get a good sampling of like, oh, these are all the cool pop punk songs that NPR put out, or cool emo stuff, or whatever heavy stuff.
I didn't even think about the NPR thing. That's
Yeah,
funny. That would have been a
yeah,
good that would have been a good domain to own.
I had negativeprogression.com, and my punk rock name was Seth Progression.
Nice. I was just thinking just NPR in general. Just
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, that would
yeah.
have been good to own so I could sell it. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd been great. It's like after all these years, I made millions from a domain
I
name.
don't know if I could have gotten npr.org though.
Yeah,
Probably npr.com wouldn't have been as desirable.
it's true. They probably just would have bought it just for the fuck of it. All right, man. Last question. What scene ethics do you hold on to this day?
What scene ethics? To work hard at something I care really deeply about, and really try to connect with my emotions as far as what I do in life, and really try to be passionate about the things I care about.